en catalán.
Hello, so now we're going to be speaking in Spanish and in English. If you need a translation, you know how it works by now, we hope. So this afternoon we're going to be focusing on future masculinities, or the masculinities of the future. I'm going to be introducing all the members of the panel. They are all members of a project on masculinities, of course. The leader is John Mercer, professor of the University of Birmingham, and I'm going to be introducing them shortly so that he can explain in more detail what the project is about. John.
I'm going to give you a context for the discussion that we're about to have. The group convened here are the steering group for our research network. So it's a very international group from across Europe. And one of the projects that me and Clarissa asked the network to do almost 2 years ago now, so before the pandemic, we asked our colleagues to think about, as we were moving towards the end of our network's activities, to think about what they thought their priorities were for research around masculinity in the future. So once this network is over, so how can we carry the network forward? Everybody wrote a little paragraph, and on the basis of these paragraphs, we're now having this discussion. In part, we're asking colleagues to think about what they thought their priorities were then and what they are now. So I'll hand you back over to Jose.
Okay. Hablo español.
I speak a terrible Spanish and a terrible Catalan, but I'll do my best. Let me now introduce Ralph Laurencio, professor at, I missed the university, sorry. He wrote a book, Bareback Porn, Masculinities, Queer Futures, The Ethics of Becoming Peak, if I understood correctly. So, in last year's conference, all of them, all the members of the panel, wrote a document or a short summary on the conference last year, and I thought it would be a good idea perhaps to choose a moment of the document and speak about the future. I would have to introduce Peter before handing it over to you. Peter is the director of the Sur Museum in Berlin. Because, you know, when we speak about the future, first we need to speak about the past. And we want to know what this museum based on sexuality is about. A museum where gender is deeply...
English, yes, I'm Peter Rieberg from Schules Museum, the Gay Museum in Berlin. So I'm looking at these questions from a slightly different angle, because I don't make my money as an academic, but as someone who's working in an archive and in the context of queer activism and in curating exhibitions on queer and gay topics. And this is maybe the first thing I do want to say. I just have a couple of short remarks here, really, that so my major research interest really is, no big surprise, queer masculinities. And in the context of the museum in Berlin, which is, again, it's a research place, it's an archive, it's an exhibition place, it's also a place for events and a community center. So it brings a lot of aspects of queer and gay cultural and social and political work together. And for me, over those past couple of years, the question of masculinity came up primarily as a question or as a challenge, actually, also in the context of queer activism. Because if we look at the notion of masculinity from the perspective of queer activism, we can raise, for example, the question, is there a place for gay men in queer activism? Gay men are not necessarily the protagonists of queer activism anymore. Queer culture and queer political activism has moved on to other topics, and I think that is Probably, you know, in each national context a little bit different. I would say Germany in this respect is not all too different from the United States here, for example. So I guess my question then is, what is queer masculinity, or what is a queer masculinity that can operate in the context of queer activism? This is very closely in the context of the museum. This is related to very practical questions. For example, what kind of exhibitions are we doing? What is the place of the representation of masculinities in these exhibitions? Is anybody still interested in the representation of masculinity here? So I have a strong interest in bringing queer and gay masculinities together, and to think about possibilities and projects of have queer masculinities as a part of a queer project, both in the activist sense, in the theoretical sense, and also actually in the aesthetic sense. I do want to say a couple of things about the archive, because I'm head of collections and archive at Schwules Museum, and that's also an interesting tension when it comes to the question of masculinity, because our place, our institution was founded in the 1980s, 35 years ago, as a gay male museum, Schwules Museum. The word schwul still indicates that. It has been diversified in the past 10, 15 years. It has become more inclusive to women, to trans people, to inter people, to people of color. However, its heritage and say 80% of the materials in the archive still refer to gay masculinity and gay men's life worlds. So how do we do this? What is the place of this heritage in a queer present? Do we have to rewrite certain chapters of gay history from a queer perspective? Do we have to, on the other hand, say, switch perspectives and criticize the queer present from the gay past? So these kinds of questions are coming up when we're talking about the archive and the material of the archive. And maybe just one last point when it comes to research and the future of masculinity studies. I also, with the support of John, finished a translation of a book that I first wrote in German called Hipster Porn, on Butt Magazine, which is similar to Kink. If you know Kink magazine, for example, maybe you also know Butt Magazine. Kink is from Barcelona, from Paco Imanolo. So this is talking about a new form of masculinity that emerged in the 21st century. So I call it, shorthand for that is hipster in a very specific way. What I'm interested in here is less, say, to look at maleness and masculinity, and this is why I'm also talking about maleness and not just masculinity, from the paradigm and register of theories of performativity and gender studies, but more in terms of new materialism and Deleuze, and to really think about maleness also as a question of matter and of materiality. And this is certainly, I think it has a little bit to do what also Clarissa was talking about this morning, how pop culture provides much more diverse forms of maleness and masculinity that cannot be accounted for by, say, certain ideologies of masculinities or their critiques, but that we sometimes do need a new vocabulary and a new language to talk about the nuances and variations and forms of maleness and masculinity. And I think in my work or in my interest and perspective, this is also first and foremost a question of the aesthetic. So how the aesthetic is a realm and a context in which forms of maleness and masculinity emerge, for example, in photography, that are beyond the registers of masculinities that are familiar to us. Maybe that's enough.
Muchas gracias, Peter. Ahora.
Thank you. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Florencio. So in the documentary or the article that he wrote last year, let me quote him, he said,
we'll focus on masculinities that are porous, constituted less by virilities than by their radical openness, cumpigs, sissies, and butch dykes that will eat you for lunch. Eso no lo puedo traducir, así que...
What do you think about the future of masculinities of your go?
I think I'll be quicker than Peter. I don't know, but I don't have much to say. Now I'm anxious. Yeah, so I think that comment around porous masculinities came out of a book that I published last year about gay pigs and contemporary kind of gay male sex cultures, and around the kind of how exchange of bodily fluids has become quite fundamental to a certain kind of production, to the production of a certain kind of contemporary gay masculinity. And to try to understand that in relation to kind of dominant narratives of the male body and histories of the male body in Western culture. So what I find interesting about contemporary masculinities and potentially questions that will open up to future masculinities is a certain kind of tension that I wrote about in that report between, on the one hand, a kind of a re-energized nostalgia for a particular idealized form of the male body, which would be, impermeable, heroic, closed on itself. So also kind of very much kind of a material question, similar to I think what Peter was talking about, how masculinity becomes flesh. And so on the other, so we see that a lot in kind of contemporary online fora, like, incel discourse, nationalist, nationalist masculinities. So that kind of nostalgic attempt to rescue masculinity from a kind of a idealized past or a kind of a mythic origin. And then on the other hand, these kinds of other forms of masculinity, like, cum pigs or, butch dykes or proud sissies, like I wrote, which tend to be a kind of as I see it, a form of masculinity that is a lot more open and welcoming, or even actively opening to the world outside and to kind of other bodies. So I think that's an interesting tension there between a kind of an attempt to cling to a kind of a hermetic masculinity, a closed masculinity, and a masculinity that is almost kind of tries to realize itself by opening itself and like polluting itself, very much through, for instance, like exchanges of bodily fluids in the case of, gay pigs, while at the same time also kind of reproducing a lot of those kind of forms of heroism that have been kind of traditionally written about in terms of the history of masculinity. So I think it's kind of an interesting moment politically to think about men and masculinities, in the sense that there seem to be really kind of radically different embodiments and material forms and material expressions of masculinity, kind of fighting one another to kind of become perhaps, the models for the future, I guess. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Thank you very much, João. And now, Jamie, professor at the King's College in London. I'm sure you've heard speaking about his book, Work That Body, Male Bodies in Digital Culture. And what really caught my attention about his report from last year's conference is the following.
One of the things to think about in the future is the place of gay men in contemporary politics of sex and gender. Una de las cosas de pensar en el futuro es el sitio de los hombres gay en la política contemporánea del sexo y el género. So, Jamie?
Thank you, Jose. Yes, so what I wrote in that report very much aligns with what Peter started off saying around the place of gay men in contemporary, the contemporary politics of sex and gender, because like him, I'm also interested in this shift that we've experienced over, I guess, the last 5, perhaps 10 years, where the kind of the flashpoints, not only in the political and activist situation, but also academically, have moved elsewhere to the trans question and to... It's much more about gender than it is about sex, I think, a lot of the times. As someone, I'm currently involved in a project that's researching gay men and gay men's intimacies, and I'm often left thinking, you know, what does it mean to be researching gay men at this moment? And when all this kind of, you know, when all this stuff is happening kind of politically and theoretically, and so one of the things that I've been looking at in the project is the kind of social media discourse around these sorts of questions. And one of the things that's quite prominent is this discourse on social media around white gays, and that white gays are especially, you know, vectors of privilege in kind of queer politics, which is, I think, absolutely recognizable to some degree and absolutely true. But I think it also leaves me with some questions, because I'm not, because I you know, in terms of, I mean, one of the big arguments around the kind of place of gay men in relation, at least, to kind of neoliberal culture of the last 30 or 40 years is that gay men have been the chief beneficiaries, or some of the key, certain types of white gay men have been key beneficiaries of the neoliberal settlement, certainly in terms of sexual liberalism and economic liberalism, and the ways that gay men have come to represent a certain progressive, that you can get a gay man in on the board of a company, or you can fly a rainbow flag, or, you know, Barclays now has pride vans in, you know, in the Pride March, and it's gay men who are being represented. And so in that respect, I think that's absolutely true. But there's also lots of other stuff around gay men in relation to neoliberalism. So one of the things that I've also researched is the changing city around London, and the fact that what neoliberal local and governments have done is absolutely transformed queer space in the city. And this isn't just gay clubs, but all sorts of queer space. There's a fantastic report that has been published by UCL, a guy called Ben Kampkin, who, I think the figure is something like there are 68% less queer spaces in London over the last decade. And that is precisely because rent has become too expensive, because they've absolutely increased the value of property prices in London. So in that respect, I think it tells a slightly more ambivalent story. It depends what we mean by neoliberalism, and I think it tells a slightly more ambivalent story about neoliberalism's or capitalism's relationship to gay men. And there's also obvious stuff that I think kind of another tension within that moment, in this moment we now inhabit, where certainly in the UK there's been an increase in homophobic violence towards gay men, as well as other kind of categories within the kind of LGBT kind of umbrella. In the UK, often asylum seekers can't successfully claim asylum on the basis that they're gay and that they might get sent back to countries where they might face persecution or violence. And so, I mean, I haven't got really any answers or any kind of conclusions, but I think there is something, like Peter, I think there is something to think about there, about what the figure of the gay man is doing in this really interesting and important kind of paradigm shift that we're experiencing in sex and gender politics. And not just in sex and gender politics, but also within the kind of history of capitalism too. So, yes, that's what I want to say. Hopefully that was...
Muchas gracias, David. Ahora os paso a Begoña, que no necesita ninguna...
Now I'm going to hand it over to Begoña. She does not need to be introduced. And, well, she wrote a very interesting report last year where she said that what she thought to be masculinity, well, she thought that we have to pay attention to masculinities, of course, but also how to ask the question about masculinities, not to speak about the importance of body, the importance of politics, the hegemonies, and to what extent hegemonies are related to violence. And she wrote that it was very important to make the link with neoliberal capitalism. Thank you very much, and I'm extremely pleased to have you all here in Barcelona. Welcome to Barcelona. I'm not sure I told you all. So my interest topics, or my main concerns regarding the future of masculinities, are basically quite similar to the ones that I already announced last year. Nonetheless, there are some new axes that have already been mentioned, and perhaps some new regards. I believe we need to pay attention in the current times to the tension existing due to the neoliberal globalization. There is a tension between uniformity and globalization, or globalism, so to speak. I recently carried out a research about the mushes in Oaxaca, which go beyond binary genders. And now, today, in Oaxaca, a new phenomena is taking place amongst the mushes. They do not consider themselves mushes anymore. Now they consider themselves as gay. And I believe this is a direct impact of globalization, because somehow they are self-imposing globalized labels and wiping out an enormous plurality existing in certain parts of the world. And the same has happened with the virgins of the Balkans, which are also disappearing. Quite recently, an article was published in the newspaper. There are only 5 of them left. So we know that sex and gender configurations are extremely rich and evolving, and the ones that we find our bodies in is constructed historically and socially, etc. We know that, but I believe that it's a major concern that we should face, in the sense that more and more identities are being wiped out by more, let's say, mainstream or global gender and sexual identities. So the tension between diversity and uniformity is key, and we need to pay attention to it. And I believe it's a topic that we need to carry out more research about, not to speak about politics and policies. Yesterday there was a panel discussion on the topic. As you know, I'm extremely concerned regarding body policy, especially in the area of body policies, both male and female bodies. In my case, my interest area is the masculine body, or the male body rather. How these bodies are being instrumentalized politically, and going back to a biological approach of things, being it the destiny, the political and economic destiny of many individuals, leading to totalitarian regimes that impose a jail which is grounded on biology. And of course, there are more and more ontologic and epistemologic windows of opportunity, but, well, it's happening, and we need to perhaps pay attention to it. So the intersection between body, gender, and politics is a field that we'll need to pay attention to in the future. Of course, there are ambivalences, paradoxes, but we'll have to be there. I'm very much interested today, and perhaps I didn't explain it in detail in the past. Again, I'm interested in the intersection between masculinity studies or research, because we have been widely discussing about the topic these days, but the important thing would be perhaps to interact with queer theory and Deleuzian feminist theories, which are extremely rich and productive in the last few years. And in this sense, I believe we are living at a time when we are in the search, and I believe this group is a good example of what I'm going to say, we're in the search for new methodological tools that allow us to express such hybridization, right, the tension between uniformity and diversity, and tools that will allow us to explore complexity, because we face a complex scenario when it comes to defining things. We lack words. There are not enough meanings available, and we perhaps need more tools for a better understanding of the outcomes of the tension between diversity and uniformity, and to see what this entails on our bodies. We need to look at bodies from another scope, and here we'll have to explore, and let me go back to Peter here, because he mentioned it, tools such as new materialisms, which are epistemologic feminisms, in fact. So tools such as new materialism, or new materialisms in plural, post-humanism, and ethic theory, if I got correctly. So in the crossing point between theories and bodies. Perhaps we can rethink bodies from another perspective and rethink the concept that I threw at you this morning about what is a body today. Because today a body does not end in our flesh and in our skin and bones. Today bodies are a very complex imbrication of affections, ideologies, cultural meanings, deep cultural meanings, amongst other items. So if I had to come up with a summary on where I believe we should place our attention in order to reflect about the future of not humanities, but rather masculinities, so this would be a few elements for it. Thank you. Thank you, Begonia. I believe this really connects to what Clarissa Smith mentioned last year. Clarissa Smith is one of the key researchers of the project. They're all important, right? But she's very important. She's a professor in Sunderland University. And last year she wrote the following. She said, "What I'm interested in is the representation of masculinities in an intersection between popular culture, and also she referred to the importance of vulnerabilities of, I was going to say ordinary men, normal, between inverted brackets, men." So, Clarissa, tell us more about it.
Project where the representation of masculinity as an intersection of popular culture, and also the idea of paying attention to ordinary men and their vulnerabilities.
Right.
Which is
Yeah.
you know, a kind of an interesting takeoff point from what Begonia just said now.
Yeah. Yes, I'm just not quite sure where I want to go right now with. I mean, I'm really interested in the ways. Most recently, we've seen so many arguments about what it means to be a man and how vicious some of the arguments have got in public discourse around, for example, you know, what it means to be toxic and the idea of woke sensibilities as well. And I think it's quite interesting. Quite interesting. It seems to be quite urgent in an era of Me Too that we start to explore some of the ways in which public discourse tries to disavow some of the problems around masculinity as it might be expressed in intimate relationships. But actually, popular culture seems to do more of that work, I think, and offers effective possibilities that, you know, some of the dilemmas of being the alpha male are uncovered in popular culture, like The Sopranos or in Succession, you know, the difficulties of being that kind of masculine in a way that doesn't then excuse those guys, right? I mean, of course, they can be read as glorified, but we equally, our kind of political spaces are filled with some of the most unpleasant kinds of masculine ideas. So, yeah, there's a lot of tension. I think that was the thing that I've picked up from what everybody else has been saying, is this kind of idea of tensions across masculinities. And yeah,
If I could probe a little bit, what caught my eye was your emphasis on representation, and I just wondered if, you know, if it was in a post as opposed to something else, or just a particular interest. Was there some reason why you mentioned that or focused on that?
Because I think there are some really interesting ways in which different ways of being male are offered to us in popular culture. And at some level, sometimes they appear to be just more of the same. I'm thinking of characters like Jon Snow in Game of Thrones, yes. Right? But actually, so a research project that I was involved in, and we published a book out of that. We found that, in fact, Jon Snow was understood to be a different kind of hero who had problems, but wasn't an anti-hero, wasn't the kind of hero that eventually comes into their own, but that actually, you know, trying to navigate power and other activities proved too much for him, right? And I think that there are quite a lot of spaces in popular culture where we're seeing similar things, and fantastic beasts and other creatures. I think it is the hero of that, played by Eddie Redmayne, is this really kind of oddly soft and empathic individual who doesn't conform to the kind of hero stereotype. And yet, at the same time, in public culture, we've still got that same sense that, you know, Tory power stands, I've got to be the biggest and the best and competitive and stuff. And it's, yeah, I guess what I meant maybe by some of that is what are the impacts on men now, you know, trying to navigate some of that, I guess. Yeah. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Clarissa.
Thank you, Clarissa. Now let me introduce you, Florian. Florian has published a book about the subject in French, Les enquêtes sur les fantômes et les masculinités. It's a research about... Oh, this microphone is not well placed. So what I'm interested in is that we have been speaking about the affection theory, and in the report that you presented last year, you said that beyond representation, we need to pay a closer attention to affections. So Florian, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. It's been now a couple of decades that the topic of affection is fashionable and is widely discussed at the academic level. So before answering your question, I would like to focus on another area. Let me say that this debate is very interesting because, to be honest, I'm a little bit fed up with the whole masculinity studies. I'm bored. I don't think it's an area where we can further explore by repeating the same thing. We keep repeating the same thing. I feel like I'm in a loop sometimes, and, you know, reflecting about the same problems and the same ideas all the time. I like this event because it's a bilingual event, a bilingual conference, and this opens, you know, doors to the participation of people from other parts of the world. So perhaps they will share another perspective with us. Let's open the windows and let some fresh air in to the room. Don't you think so? Well, having said that, I have been exploring emotions-related methodologies. In my case, I have been working with gay, bisexual, and straight men, working on their desires, their kinks, and in these interviews, I left a room for them to feel, for them to get in touch with their emotions and bodily feelings, and to reflect with them about areas in which desire somehow repeats the same old emotions and same old desires, by trying to leave room for darker feelings or darker desires and kinks when, you know, things happen in participants' bodies that do not match with what they say from a more mental perspective. I've been working for quite a long time with men with very homonormative or heteronormative desires, but when you get when you dig in and you speak about masturbation and their desires, you see that their desire is perhaps not as mainstream as they think. And you tell them, this is not the ideal representation of your desire, let's speak about it. And I believe it's an interesting technique to use. What I would be interested in the future is to use these emotion-based methodologies to better understand how men sometimes are attached to or locked in stereotyped ways of thinking and feeling and loving and desiring, and trying to free them, liberate them. And I came up with an idea while listening to Clarissa mentioned yesterday, or this morning rather, about how sometimes the research on gay and straight men are split apart. In French activism, there are new ways of prioritizing bisexuality or pansexuality, which are other mechanisms or ways to open windows, break silos, and perhaps go towards a more intersectional regard on things and also masculinities. Thanks. So before, well, I wanted to ask you something else. In your report, you mentioned a French documentary called Balls on the Table. Tell us a little bit more about it. That really caught my attention, the documentary entitled Balls on the Table. How does this match the research on masculinities and the future of masculinities? Les couilles sur la table, the balls on the table, is a documentary led by a French journalist. It was extremely successful in France. It's a podcast, not a documentary. And as a result, the topic of masculinities became kind of mainstream for a while. And I believe that in France, the academic narrative are limited, and that's why we need journalists to convey the message on new masculinities, and the image of the balls on the table disgusted many people, and I believe the journalist never justified herself. She just, wanted to use this expression. I don't know if the image exists in Spanish or in English, but in French, when you say, I'm going to put my balls on the table, it means I'm going to be courageous, I'm going to be daring, and I'm going to be brave. It's a very masculine expression to use, of course, but the idea is perhaps to chop off the balls, and let's just put the topic on the table. It's not so much about the balls, but rather about seeing who is in the table to open the debate, who wants to speak about it, right? And diversifying points of view. So it came a moment when I felt stuck, and I thought, oh, there is such a proliferation of narratives on masculinities that I don't really know what to do anymore. In France, the new university bill limits our capacity to carry out interesting research, to be honest, because we're going to try and save what's out there. Well, universities are dying, let's put it this way. So this documentary, this podcast called Les couilles sur la table, is led by journalists. So now, John Mercer, professor at the Birmingham City University, and another key partner of the project that has lasted for quite a long time, as it has already been said. He has very interesting books, a book on the cinema history, melodrama, porn, so a long list of interesting topics, and in his last year's report, he presented a long list of topics. What Florian says, right, the whole oppression thing, well, for John, oppression is creative, according to what you wrote. So what I chose out of your list of topics in order to tackle the crisis of masculinity has to do with anxiety, digital platforms, and the post-lockdown situation.
You had a whole series, a long series of interests. So the crisis of masculinity, that masculinity is a site of anxiety, the digital platforms and the language and meaning making provide opportunities, and that the aftermath of the pandemic might present a moment of rupture, of potential discontinuity. So, take your pick and try to relate it to this question of, the future.
Just listening to Florian just then, I was thinking that what's interesting is that putting your balls on the table is an act of machismo, but what it also is opening yourself up to being vulnerable. That you're providing the opportunities for somebody to smash your balls with a baseball bat or whatever. And I think for me that's one of the kind of perennial themes in terms of the way in which masculinity is enacted in popular culture, and one of the ways that popular accounts and academic accounts try to frame masculinity, and it is this perpetual crisis. What's particularly interesting for me about this idea of masculinity being in crisis is that the term was originally coined in the late 1950s by a journalist, an American journalist, and it was in reaction to the perceived growth in prominence and strength and the emancipation of American women in the jobs markets. And the consequence of that was that men were being enfeebled by these increasingly virile and thrusting women. So part of what masculinity is coalesces around, or what coalesces around the idea of masculinity, is that it's imperiled all the time, and that it's imperiled by the encroachment of femininity. And I think what's been very interesting in recent years is the extent to which the signs and symbols and meanings of femininity have been assimilated and co-opted within discourses of masculinity. So body consciousness, fashion, beauty, all of these ideas have been co-opted within a broader conversation around masculinity. So masculinity has expanded as a discursive category, and I think that's particularly happened over the past 20 years. So it's expanded as a discursive category. I kind of feel in order to, at some level, challenge what's perceived as the overwhelming strength of femininity, which is kind of counterintuitive. You know, within popular discourse, we talk about the idea of we used to talk about the idea of the weaker sex, that femininity was somehow, was enfeebled and impoverished and at threat the whole time. Whereas in actual fact, I think in terms of the way in which conversation about masculinity is recurrently framed, it's completely the other way around, that masculinity is constantly under threat. And this idea of masculinity as being at threat goes way beyond the mid-1950s. There are kinds of, there are moments in Renaissance England, in 18th century Italy, in France in the 17th century, where you can see these conversations about that masculinity is being challenged, that masculinity becomes weak, that masculinity is tainted by femininity in some kind of way. And I just think these are interesting conversations or interesting sets of ideas that they kind of never go away. I hate the idea of universalities. But there is something universal in the nature of that conversation, and it's counterintuitive. And I think the reason that it teases me or kind of piques my interest is the fact that it is counterintuitive. And why is this? Why is it that we don't recognise that this runs counter to what we imagine the dominant discourse to be? The dominant discourse is actually far more complicated, again, than we think it is. The division between the sexes and the way in which power is ascribed to the sexes is much more complicated and nuanced, and is different at different points in time, is different in different geographical locations, is different generationally. So yeah, this idea that masculinity is under threat is one that I keep on coming back to,
Okay, gracias, John.
Thank you, John. So before, I think someone has a question.
To that, because I thought it was... I think it's really interesting because on the one hand, that you have this... Is it a question that it is masculinity being threatened by femininity, or is it a question that what's happening is a kind of a reckoning with the fact that masculinity itself will never be actualized as it was imagined? And on one hand, you have this kind of, I guess, it makes sense that in a patriarchal society, it is masculinity that is constantly anxious and neurotic about itself. And either you have a kind of, at the level of like material relations and gender divisions of labor, where then the man is kind of posited as a need for a particular kind of social relation. Then you have the kind of, I don't know, like Lacanian position that, the ego is split and actually you're always chasing the thing that, that fantasy, that phantasm. So it's really a kind of an internal, masculinity is in crisis from the first time it was kind of uttered, right?
Because it's kind of predicated on crisis.
Yeah.
Camille Paglia, who, indeed. But, as they kind of say, a stop clock is right twice a day, yeah? And she's great at the kind of aphorism, she's great at the kind of quotable thing, and periodically she'll kind of say something that you think, yeah, that does have a resonance. Even if she's cancelled, I'm gonna uncancel her and allow her in for this tiny moment and then boot her out again. Yeah, and one of the ways in which she tried to describe masculinity was arguing that masculinity is kind of like walking a tightrope, because what's surrounding you the whole time is this massive femininity, and that consequently, there are a very tiny range of things that are masculine, but everything else is feminine. Now, she kind of said that in the early 1990s. I don't think that's necessarily true anymore. I think you could probably say masculinity is kind of runway size now. There are more things, but there are still lots of things that, the threats. And that's why I'm always very dubious of claims that the kind of inclusive masculinity claims, the idea of fluid masculinity. I think fluid up to a point, inclusive up to a point. In actual fact, there are still ways in which most men can deviate in quite slight ways in their own specific locales, within their specific, social, cultural locations, and that won't be a great thing for them to do.
Thank you, John. Before turning it over to you, I have asked Peter Rayberg to summarize some of these discussions and actually kind of, bring up some discussion points. I think part of the problem of talking across disciplines, we all come from different places, is often that we understand vocabularies differently, and sometimes kind of misunderstandings occur through that. So I hope this as an exercise is something that will facilitate the questioning. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, I'll try my best. You have to help me a little bit because I have to admit I overestimated my capacity. Microphone. Oh, that's a Good idea, yes. And I was just about to say you have to help me a little bit because I have to admit I overestimated my capacity to understand Spanish. So maybe you can add a couple of, I do get it somehow, but I'm not, maybe you can say a couple of sentences about Florian's and Begonya's contributions. Thank you. All right, so I'll try to just make some points that might bring the very different projects together, starting with Joao's research. And Joao pointed out that he is really looking at two very radically different forms of embodiment. So one would be the PIC subjectivities, the porosity of masculinities, of gay masculinities in specific sexual subcultures, and also, you know, a language that he used here, an open form of masculinity, poroseness, openness, etc. But he contextualized this, that this is all happening in a world and in a political context where we also find something like a nostalgic return to heroic masculinities. So on the one hand, we have porous masculinities. On the other one, we have closed masculinities, heroic masculinities, or we could also maybe say toxic masculinities, something that Clarissa brought up later. Such a contradiction between, let's just say, normative and non-normative forms of masculinities in the present is also something we find within gay men's culture itself, as Jamie pointed out, because on the one hand, we could say that white gays, in particular, are vectors of privilege within the context of queer critical discourse of the present, and even though there's something you know, true about this to the extent that gay men are key beneficiaries of neoliberalism, it is also true that simultaneously we have an increase of homophobic violence. So to bring these contradictions together and to look for a place or to describe a place, to come up with a place of what is gay men's place in this field of shifting economic and sexual politics. This is something we have to still work on, right? This is something these are like some of the key contradictions that we're dealing with at the moment, and that represent a challenge. Clarissa looks at these questions in the larger realm of popular culture and TV shows, for example, like Successions. But Clarissa too observed, and one of the keywords in her presentation was tension here, between, for example, I already mentioned a toxic masculinity on the one hand and vulnerability on the other, and that the task for men in these TV shows, for example, is to navigate these different poles. And John kind of already summarized some of this for me by talking about masculinity being in perpetual crisis and in peril all the time, because it's always, masculinity always is endangered of being feminized. And John suggested that there's something universal about this discourse on crisis of masculinity. I maybe just want to add two things here. This is, of course, Joao already mentioned Lacan, a very psychoanalytic notion of masculinity in a way. Which I'm surprised that this is coming from you, but you know, in a nutshell, this is what castration anxiety is, right? I mean, this is very Freudian. This is a very Freudian account of masculinity, And the other thing I wanted to add is, if we talk about crisis is of course also a precarious word in the sense, because what do you do with crisis, right? You can fight the crisis and you go back to the heroic masculinities that Joao was talking about, or you can embrace the crisis and become porose. It's your turn.
I had an order in mind, yeah. I structured a series of talks, and I hope there was a flow to it, really. And issues that I think come up and that recur are issues of representation from Clarissa, issues of politics, yeah, a kind of a transgressive embodiment, questions of affect, and then with Jamie, and something that recurs throughout the panel, is the changing role of gay men, yeah, within this discourse, or these discourses that proliferate yeah, in ways that become unmanageable, that proliferate in ways that are fascinating, and that keep on changing. So with that in mind, I turn it over to you. Questions, please. Yes.
Because I'm just thinking, many of us have expressed some kind of tiredom with what we've been doing in the field of masculinities. But when talking about the future of masculinities, none of us has commented on the disappearance of masculinities. And that is something I am just thinking of. I don't know what for, right? But I mean, maybe we should start thinking about the disappearance of, I don't know what that means, but it just came to my mind. You know?
It's an interesting notion, isn't it? Because if masculinity historically has been what all men fail at, then its disappearance seems rather improbable.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's always in crisis, it's always threatened. Okay, let's just burn it, you know, like fires. Well, just...
But it's
just
also hot and sexy. So, you know, like you don't want to let it go. You just want to kind of manage it.
Yeah. Yeah, because you think, well, it's so problematic, you know, that right. Maybe what we have to do is to get rid of it. We don't know how to handle the diversity, the porosity, the hybridity, the crisis, where the body ends. Well, let's forget about it. You know, maybe it's not a good idea.
Yeah, I think it's an, what you say is echoes, because I think, for instance, a different experience maybe I have from you with Joao is that for me, both gay culture I see is very good as having fun with patriarchal norms. The idea that patriarchy can be fun and you can get hard on it, and it, but it's about it. I mean, it's just about about
so
it.
We are rehearsing Leo Berzani versus Dennis Altman back in the day.
But I wonder. Personally, I don't see in the gay scene. I don't see much future for change, and I don't see. Yeah, personally, but.
Me pregunto si hay tópicos.
I'm wondering if there are any topics out there that you're interested in and that we have not addressed, and perhaps you want to hear from us. So let's hand it over to the audience. If you want us to raise any point that we haven't, or if you want to question any of the things that have been said. Don't be shy. Yep, please go ahead.
We're recording this, so the mic's important, sorry.
Not only you're recording it, but I need the mic.
Silent. I actually, what you said, I resonate with a lot of things. Let's say like this, you know. With I think there is about what men do or boys do. There is still a lot of things to say about that. Any kind of men, any kind of boys. There is real practices that are getting on the way. as Clarissa said this morning, that is necessary to address and to look at. There are discourses, discourse in a very Foucauldian, material and symbolic way, that are very significant, happening around masculinities, as you said this morning. It's still very significant to look at, to do something with this. So at the same time, yeah, I feel like the boredom that you said, right? That somehow it's like always swimming around the same, in the same waters. What do we do with this feeling, you know? It seems, somehow I was thinking, listening to you, that this need to get a grip onto masculinities is as if, like, the field needs this to exist as a field, right? Otherwise, there is no marketing as a field in academia. And this is true, right? At some point, writing about masculinity was sexy, or maybe it's still sexy, right? So we need a new category to market in a different way. I don't mean in this way to dismiss the work that has been done on masculinities. I'm in that basket too, right? I'm doing that type of work too. At the same time, yeah, I agree with Jeff Hearn that with the idea of a subfield within gender studies. And yeah, it's just some thoughts. And it's hot and sexy. What exactly is hot and sexy, right? I believe that, what?
That was a joke. Don't quote me on that.
Jokes are significant.
I mean, in the sense, so okay, what was behind, sorry, can I answer? Or,
yeah.
Sorry, I think what I was saying is that it's kind of, I think it's, while we can think about abolishing masculinity or ending masculinity, or while we can talk about abolishing gender, that as long as there is a kind of a drive that propels people towards something, that and that manifests as like a sex gender system, that we can talk about undoing it as much as we can, but it is still a material reality in the world, right? So when I say it's sex and hot, it's because people desire it. Many people desire it, many people don't. But it materializes at the level of desire. And so it was a joke in the sense that, you know, because I was thinking, okay, I mean, what happens to me as a gay man if we do avoid masculinity? But also, what is masculinity? Does it belong to men only, right? So what can we do with it? So yeah, it was a joke, but I think the importance of desire in materializing certain kinds of bodies and ensuring that they continue to exist is something not to be overlooked. I think that's what I meant.
James, did you want to add anything to that? Yes.
Not necessarily to that. I'm just, I mean, I understand this whole wanting to get that provocation that you made, and I'm listening to the people in the panel, and I mean, I know that we all work on questions of male bodies or masculinities, but I don't know that this panel represented masculinity studies, at least as I understand it. No one talked about hegemonic masculinity. No one talked about inclusive masculinity. No one, that, you know, this is a wide range. I mean, I think one of the benefits of this network has been is the kind of interdisciplinarity and the different kind of, I mean, we're all working within, you know, parallel fields, but people talked about new materialism and affect theory, and people talked about the politics of representation and the questions of activism. And so for me, what I think has been interesting about the events that Clarissa and John have put on is that it feels slightly at a tangent to masculinity studies in a way. I've been to some of that event in Newcastle that we went to, where you see a lot of papers that prove inclusive masculinity, or you see a lot of people that tell you what hegemonic masculinity is, or hybrid masculinity, and that sense of I feel that too. I don't need to read those papers anymore. I know exactly what they're going to tell me, and I don't think anybody here does that. And I don't think that the event that you've put together, or the you know, are interested in that, and the masculinity and the male body becomes a way into asking much broader, wider questions about, ontological questions or conjunctural questions, and so it's a way into asking. So I share that exhaustion with the field of masculinity studies, but I'm not sure that we do that. I don't know if I'm speaking for you, but yes.
Well, when we originally wrote the proposal for this research network, I think in part it was in response to, it was about trying to initiate a conversation that ran parallel to the critical masculinities studies discourse, but was not about the critical masculinities studies discourse. So it wasn't about empirical research, and I am going to use quotation marks when I say empirical research. It was about interdisciplinarity. It was about encouraging voices that just didn't get involved in that conversation to begin with, and disciplinary and methodological approaches that you didn't see within that broad field of study. I think Kritsi is really talking about something that is ever so important, and I think we as researchers have to always be thinking about the ways in which fields and disciplines coalesce and what becomes orthodox, which voices are important and which voices get marginalised and minimalised. We have to constantly be aware of those things, and for us to be progressive or to aspire to be progressive, one of our, I would say, one of the most important jobs we've got is to challenge orthodoxies and to challenge what's taken as the taken for granted or the common sense perspective. So I think what Kritsi is pointing to is something that's fundamentally important for me, and it's kind of, I guess one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this network, and one of the things that I'd really want to see more of or read more of, is what I'm very conscious of is the extent to which masculinity research in its broadest sense is really white and very anglophone for the most part. And what we've tried to do is present the opportunity and provide the arena for people who were not Anglophone to engage in that conversation. And I think that's an important thing to do. I'm not convinced that we've been as successful as I would have liked us to have been in that endeavour. But when I think about what I would like to see us doing in the future, it would be about hearing a much more diverse range of voices, geographically diverse in terms of class and social origin. Yet again, academic research tends to be middle-class people speaking to middle-class people. That's something that really matters to me, that we do something about that. So I say thank you for raising the issue, because I think it is an important one, but not just for us. Anybody who's involved in our endeavour should always be thinking, should not be taking stuff for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I have two interventions here from the panel. First Florian and then Janie.
Yeah. What I've heard a lot today is that tiredness around hegemonic
I'm going to switch into Spanish. So, what I heard, today we've raised the point of how bored we are of speaking over and over about hegemonic masculinity. But let me go back to the Gramscian idea of hegemony. There are studies on masculinity, of course, that are somehow coalitions or temporary alliances between, well, feminist movement and gay movements at the beginning of, well, at least in Australia during the 70s and the 80s when the concept emerged. And for me, understanding such research as a coalition or as an alliance of interests? Well, that's the way I take it. From my perspective, nonetheless, it doesn't work. I mean, a study never works when in the coalition or in the alliance we keep inviting the same voices, or we keep meeting as we've always had, or we keep interacting as we always had. We need to perhaps try new forms of interaction, try new forms of coalition, new forms of alliance, get new people in, listen to new scopes and perspectives, and keep carrying out research. From a Gramscian perspective, it's about thinking about the policy of such alliances, which is still relevant. Ben?
It builds on both what John and what Florian, if I understood you correctly, has just said. One thing that I don't think we haven't spoken about is trans politics, and I think that's largely because trans politics is largely concerned with trans women and the debates on the right and within the feminist movement about the place that trans women have in contemporary culture. And a group that often gets forgotten are trans man or trans masculine people. And in the project that I'm currently involved in, my co-I was rightly very insistent that of the 40 people, more or less 40 people that we wanted to interview, a significant about gay and bisexual men about their intimate lives, basically, that we include trans men, and there was no reason not to include trans men. And we ended up getting about 8 or 9 trans men or trans masculine identified people. And it's been absolutely fascinating in terms of pulling the rug under, certainly my feet, in terms of the way that I think about gay men, because they responded to the call of our recruitment material, which is about gay and bisexual men. They occupied the same similar and overlapping spaces to the gay men that we normally think about. But their way into it and their experience of it is so completely different, yet they are using they are identified and using the terms men and masculinities in their self-identification, in their practices of intimacy, and in the cultural spaces that they belong to. And I mean, we are currently thinking through how those people are making us think about gay and queer intimacies, because it's an entirely different biography, it's an entirely different story, but nonetheless, it's under the kind of guise of men and masculinities, and from their perspective, from their self-identification. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation too, because I agree with John in terms of bringing in a variety of different perspectives, and having done that has posed real challenges to the way that the project is thinking about queer men, basically.
Thank you, Jamie. ¿Hay alguna pregunta de la sala?
Okay. Follows on from what Jamie said. I mean, I think that there are things that we need to examine about the ways in which certain kinds of politics cohere around particular masculine issues, right? So why is it that trans issues are presented in terms of trans women and not trans men? What are the politics of that? What are the politics of the kinds of crises of masculinity that end up being discussed in policy forums and in public spaces? How is it then that, there may be worries about what's happening to working class boys, right? And there's lots of research in the 1970s in British cultural studies looking at why working class boys get working class jobs and various other kinds of examinations. And yet actually not very much has changed in that, right? And it seems to me that some of the issues about masculinity are ones that, or certainly the ones that end up in the policy spaces and political spaces, are the ones that continue to stasis, actually, and keep us organised around a set of considerations about men and women too. So, yeah, I don't know where that takes us, except that I think that the politics of many of our discussions, public discussions about masculinity, need to be examined from a variety of angles and actually recognise how far some of those are about derailing more porous understandings of masculinity, or keeping the same voices in the same place. I mean, I think think that's, yeah.
I mean, just a thought on that. I think it's so interesting how, if you look at the Birmingham School, yeah, what gets picked up on in terms of cultural studies is, you know, either work on ideology or work on media, and things like learning to labor get completely marginalized. Yeah?
Yeah.
And that was at least a core work as any of the rest.
Yeah.
So, just a thought.
Peter wants to.
Yeah, Peter?
This goes back to Jamie's point about the dialogue between trans studies and gay male queer studies. And, you know, for my work, for example, I mentioned previously that I'm more interested in discourses on materiality as opposed to performativity. And this is a suggestion or even a paradigmatic shift that you know, was after all also introduced by Paul Preciado in his book Testo Junkie, and also in earlier writings, and the ways, so a very early critique from a trans perspective of certain paradigms of gender studies and masculinity studies. So I think this would be an example. So if we talk about materiality, if we talk about shapes of the body, alterations of the body, if we talk about hormones, if we talk about biopolitics. So this, we already have a paradigmatic shift that, you know, is very much informed by trans studies.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. And it just makes me think about what Clarissa was saying before about popular culture, because, so theoretically and epistemologically and academically, I think, well, Preciado has done some interesting work, and there are other people that do interesting work on trans men. I'm thinking Eliza Steinbach has written an interesting book that includes discussion of trans men. But interestingly, popular culture doesn't really. We were trying to look for Anglophone representations of trans men, and there was one interesting storyline in Tales of the City, the most recent Netflix kind of version. But that's kind of it in the last 2 years. And so there's a really, I mean, in mainstream popular culture, before you
pornography? Like gay porn, it's
but not nearly, but
it's so
compared to
such a change, I think, in recent years with
but compared
trans
to
men.
compared to the Caitlyn Jenner levels of representation, and I mean, seriously, you know, and compared to Pose and the degree to which that is being discussed in mainstream media, and of course to include pornography in mainstream media, it's a complete absence, and that's fascinating. It's not a complete absence, it's much less represented, and that's interesting.
This is really interesting, and just an observation. I don't have a reading of it yet, what it means, but I think it's different in photography and art. If we think about, for example, Della Graus Vulcano, who was also part in our recent exhibition at Schules Museum. He's been doing this work since the 1990s or 1980s, actually, and there are many others. So,
But I mean, Della Graus is subcultural, essentially. I mean, why is there not a transmasculine Caitlyn Jenner? I'm talking about the level of popular culture, but I don't disagree with what you're saying.
No, I'm not.
No.
I'm not contradicting either. It's just interesting that, you know, there is a place, but you're right. It's subculture, or it's more maybe also a theoretical art criticism discourse. You know, Preciado also is working in the art field, as we know. So there seems to be a niche for that.
Sure.
It's also. Oh, sorry. It may be also something to do with the kind of toxic discourse on trans narratives, both in the UK and the US, among some so-called feminists, right? Around, which I think it also has maybe to do with this narrative, that something to do maybe with what John was talking about earlier. It's not so much the threat, like the kind of the figure of the man who castrates themselves or like becomes feminized, but on a way that it's actually this kind of sense of like appropriation or invasion of a space designated for cis women or a body. So maybe that's because the narrative is seen as, in popular culture, as more thrilling, dangerous, whatever it is.
Yeah, Caitlyn Jenner produces a body that to be looked at in the traditional sense. No, yeah, it's, yeah.
We have 1 minute, so I really want to give everyone the opportunity of asking a question if you have one. No? Well, on that note, thank you very much for being with us today. Thanks to all our panelists. I think on the one hand, you know, we've had all of these discussions about crisis, competing definitions, dislodgement of object of study. On the other hand, we've had all these very specific projects, historically based, focused on processes that are constantly changing and that I think exhibit all the best bits of research. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.